Okay, so I think it should be all good now. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Cool, perfect. Let's get cracking then. So, hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are discussing imbalances, talking about muscle imbalances, and it's become quite apparent to myself, especially now with all the cycling and stuff being relatively unilateral, that I've been feeling a lot more going through, say, my left side or my right side in certain exercises, or feeling things getting fatigued more. So I thought it'd be a really interesting topic to discuss, because as more people are running and cycling and so forth, and just training in general, there's the unilateral work which becomes everyone kind of dreads, because they're never too sure about, if they're going to be able to do it properly or anything like that. So, Ash, how do you think would be a good? Let me just start this podcast again. So going off an absolute tangent. So, right, okay. Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Ash and myself today are discussing muscle imbalances. So, Ash, first of all, what is an imbalance?
Good question, mate. I think if you wanted to have a catch-all statement to describe what a muscular imbalance is, or an imbalance in general, to keep it relatively vague but actually accurate, it's a suboptimal distribution of a certain movement quality in the body. So the point I want to make there is that it doesn't necessarily have to be strength. It can be flexibility or mobility or even motor control. So at its simplest, like the classic imbalance people think of is, I've got one side stronger than the other, one leg is stronger than the other. At its most complex, it also takes into account planes of motion, muscles, and different qualities, so a mixture of strength, flexibility, and motor control. So you could have a situation where the right leg is overloaded because the right glute med is tight in the frontal plane, the left adductor is tight in the frontal plane, and then the right glute max is bailing out in the transverse planes. You've got all these combinations that could be going on together, which is usually the way the body works, because it will have some sort of compensation to achieve the movement task that you've set it. And it gets quite creative in using different strategies to achieve it. Yeah, that's probably where I'd start with what an imbalance is. It's probably a little bit more complicated than you hoped for, but yeah, that's sort of how I see it.
It's really pretty clear. I think it's definitely something where, through all the different styles of training over the years and so forth, it becomes really apparent that way when one side is normally weaker than the other or something like that. And I feel like myself, I've always known that, say, my left side is, even though it may be a bit weaker, it always can do things better than my right. And I feel that a lot of the time that's just because my right side can muscle things, it becomes lazy. So it knows what to recruit everything, and it can recruit a lot more than it actually needs to do a really simple task. Whereas on my left side, I know that everything has to be so much more precise, because it hasn't got that strength necessarily behind it as easily and as readily available as my right hand side. It takes more focus, but it's probably a better quality of movement.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make, that the overused side is usually the dysfunctional one. So if your right side does more work, it's probably had to create compensatory strategies to deal with the extra workload. Whereas because the left side is kind of on holiday and having a nice time, it has never had the need to develop a compensation pattern to do more work, because it doesn't do that much work compared to the right. And it also touches on another good point I wanted to say in terms of what is an imbalance. It doesn't have to just be side to side of the same area. It could also be within different joints or areas of the body. So you could have an imbalance in that a classic one is there's an uneven distribution of workload between the hips and the back when deadlifting, and that there's more going to the back than is optimal mechanics. So that's why a lot of people get back pain, because the hips aren't doing enough and the back's doing too much. And then they might end up having super strong backs as a result, which is sort of an unintended benefit. But long term, that could be an issue.
Nice. So In just on that then, so when you say long term it could be an issue, in what kind of way? Because having, obviously using the deadlift as the example, so having a stronger back, yes, you're going to then be utilizing your back a lot more than your hips, and your hips can probably take a lot more of the brunt force, which they should be able to do. So does that mean then over time your hips will then start to struggle to take the load because your back is the first receiver basically of the loads?
Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of the birth of air quotes bad motor pattern, that your body is now developing a preference for loading up the lower back rather than the hips. And this is where we need to define what optimal distribution of work should be. As a general principle, we want the biggest, strongest muscles doing the most work. So the glutes are the biggest, strongest muscles in the body. In something like a deadlift, they should be doing as much work as we can get them to do. Like one thing that helps understand that is you rarely hear of somebody pulling a glute, because you almost can't get them to do too much work because they're so big and so strong compared to other muscles in your body. But a lot of people will overdo their backs and get back pain from deadlifting. So if we can shift that workload from the back into the hips, we tend to not get as many problems as we might do. And so if we're seeing that happening in somebody where everything's happening in the back, we've got to ask, why is it all going in the back? What isn't taking the workload that it should in what we deem as optimal mechanics?
Yeah, and I guess as well, when it comes to imbalances, as you kind of already mentioned about like planes of movement as well, because I know, like I say, tweaked my glute, shall we say, because I moved laterally too fast and my body wasn't prepared to do that. So it was just saying that was like and I could just feel that tension essentially is a real sharp pain, like right deep. It felt into the glutes and purely just come from a sidestep, and I was just trying to push off a bit too fast, and that was then due to an imbalance basically, because I haven't prepped myself over time for that movement, and then my right side again was weaker than my left. So, and I just think over time it's because of obviously everything's been on my right side because I'm extremely right-sided. So, but so in general, like so it'd be interesting to understand how do imbalances kind of come about? We've touched on the fact that obviously lifetimes of being like, say, right-handed or left-handed and everything on your right foot or so forth. But is there things that maybe make these the imbalances occur like beyond just the right side, left side, like anything? For sure. Like that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to understand about imbalances is that our bodies are incredible adaptation machines. Like whatever we ask our bodies to do, they will start to adapt to make it easier to do next time. And that is the whole principle of the training effect, right? If you do a task repeatedly, your body gets better at it and adapts to make your life easier in future. However, one of the things we say at Red Pill actually is that you're always training something. So if you do an office job, you're training your body to be sat in a chair working on a computer for 8 to 10 to 12 or more hours per day. And that actually makes you better at doing that. So if your function is to bash out PowerPoint presentations at a high rate of knots, then sitting in your chair is great training for that. However, that is not great training if you want to snatch heavy. The adaptations that it's having on your body are counterproductive for that opposite function. So always think of your body as basically the rolling average of what you've asked it to do recently. So if you're reinforcing, I want you to be sat down and static and sort of hunched over a keyboard, your body's going to make that easier for you next time round by sort of deactivating a lot of muscles in the hip, having some adaptive shortening and tightening, maybe in your hip flexors, slightly rounded posture if you don't sit straight in your chair, which does save you energy next time you go to knock out that PowerPoint presentation, but is in a lot of circumstances the opposite of what you actually want your body to be doing. So that's one way that we get sort of postural imbalances, in that our body doesn't like to be in the shapes that we want it to for the purpose of training. But essentially, if you, like you say, if you're doing a one-sided sport, if you're very one-sided as a person, over time you're just reinforcing to your body that I do everything on my right-hand side. So I do all my skilled motor control movements like writing or cooking or anything like that is all right-sided dominant. So in a circumstance where your body has to make a decision as to how it goes about a task, it's always going to prefer the side that's easier. And that just compounds over time because you're just saying right side, right side, right side for pretty much everything. And yeah, like I say, it's the rolling average. So if that's been going on for a really long time, when you go to the gym, it's not a surprise that you choose to use your right side more, given the slightest opportunity. Even in a bilateral movement, you're probably going to favour the side that you've trained better.
Yeah, I think especially when you take it into the gym environment, it's those type of things definitely magnified because, as you say, we adapt to day to day because most of us are not just in the gym all the time. Even as a PT, when you work in the gym, you're not in the gym training all day. Okay, each individual, but so when you do then train for say that hour to maybe 2 a day, you suddenly put your body under those different stresses and you go from being essentially homeostasis, which is you're either standing or sitting and stuff like that, to then demanding such high skilled movements, and your body's like, hang on a minute, how do I do it? So that's where I guess, like, you know, when we say warm up, movement preps, priming, all these sort of things, it's basically telling your body, right, we're going from sitting or standing to then training. So it's that bit going from A to B, because otherwise, and I know from personal experience, like I'm very prone to not warming up, shall we say, and just going quite heavy quite quickly. And most of the time I'll get away with it, and I really will. But at what cost? Normally it's then a couple of like sessions down the line and stuff like that. Maybe that same week, by the time Thursday comes around, I'm very beaten up because I've overworked certain muscles because they weren't necessarily switched on. And they weren't prepped and primed, ready to say lift. I was able to muscle it through, but then at what cost? Most likely training volume then dropping because I can't then train. Yeah. So I think when it comes to like those type of imbalances, it's hard to really fully understand until you actually put yourself into a situation which is a unique situation like training when you think of your day to day.
Exactly.
So,
and I think, sorry, mate, just on that one. One thing you just reminded me of there is frequency. So if you train more often, you're also reminding your body of its other functions. Whereas if you just train once a week, you've got 6 days of adapting to being in a chair and then 1 day of training. So your body is adapting has more time to adapt away from training. Whereas if you're constantly reinforcing the message that this is what I want you to be able to do, then you're much less likely to sort of tighten up and adapt to that chair-based posture. And we see this really clearly in sportsmen who used to play a lot of sport at, say, school or university, then they get into working life, and they might still be reasonably fit from doing gym-based training, but they're not playing that sport. So say they played loads of football at uni and never got injured, then they start working in an office, they go to the gym, so they're still reasonably fit, but they're not doing the football, and their body then stops being well adapted for football because they're just not doing that as often. And that's a real classic injury pattern, is that people don't really understand why they're not, because they're fit and they're strong, they're maybe fitter and stronger than they've ever been in the gym, but because they haven't been reinforcing that adaptation for the demands of football specifically, then that's where they can unfortunately get an injury. And the same principle is applied to imbalances, right? If you're not sending those signals to say, this is the way in which I want you to use your body, there's a conflict between what your body, your actions are telling your body to do and how it's actually been adapted over time.
Yeah, I think that's where, you know, like going like, say, for rehab style movements or anything like that, like, you know, so you go and see a movement specialist, someone like yourself or someone like Franco, who we've had on the podcast before, and you get some prescription exercises to kind of help correct some movement inefficiencies, imbalances and so forth. And you do them, say, for like 2 weeks and you feel great. You're like, oh, fuck, I'm better. And then you stop. And then you're like, cool, okay, yeah, I'm good now. And then you feel good for a little bit. And then it all starts to undo. And you're like, but, they must not work. It's like, they were supposed to. It's like I think the thing that people need to fully realize is when you've got an issue like that, like an imbalance or any type of like basically a problem, a dysfunction of some sort, you most of the time it's built up over a long period of time. So if you think it's going to just, once it disappears the first time, it hasn't necessarily just disappeared. You just now are moving a little bit better, but it's now not stronger. The others, it still takes time. So that's why it's so important that anyone doing these movements and say prescribes exercises to help reinforce your better mechanics, to basically do it more and consistently do it, because as you said, like, just reminded me, because when you spoke about frequencies and doing it daily, because you're telling your body, right, this is my new movement pattern, this is how I'm supposed to be moving, and it's going to take time. And even when it doesn't start to feel better, it doesn't mean it's then finished. So you've got to keep going and keep going. And that's where I think the biggest pitfall with most people's, say, rehab plans is they think once it feels initially better that they're done. And it's the actual realization that it's going to take a little bit longer.
That's a really good point. I think it goes back to that rolling average of you've now just done it enough recently for it to show improvement. It doesn't mean you've done it enough to overwrite everything that's gone before it. So if we look at that deadlift example, you've got hundreds, thousands, potentially tens of thousands of reps deadlifting in your old motor pattern, loading up your back more than your hip. We've now taught your hip to take a little bit more work and enough work to take the burden off the back where you're now out of pain. That doesn't mean that every deadlift you do from now on is only going to go into your hip and not into your back. That signal needs to be reinforced and that pattern overwritten. So think about how many reps you've done in the bad style. It took that long for you to ingrain that motor pattern. So maybe it'll take a similar amount of time, hopefully not exactly the same amount of reps, but you've got to reprogram that default motor pattern to be the better mechanics. And that only happens through reps and reinforcement, like any skill. If you want to change your golf swing, even if you're not injured, but you want to change something you've done the same for a really long period of time, you're going to have to drill it in and repeat it, because at the slightest hint of uncertainty, your body's going to default to what it knows to be a solution. And it's that classic sequence of unconscious incompetence through to unconscious incompetence through to unconscious competence. Like, you've got to drill that new motor pattern so many times until you now use your hip in the deadlift without thinking about it. But it does take reps and hard work to get there. So it's not a short fix, unfortunately, in situations like that.
Exactly. And I think it sometimes gets a bit daunting for people when they think of, like, I have to think so much just doing a deadlift. There's so many things to think about. And it's like, how do you think about it? It's like, because I don't think about all these things anymore. Like, they were things. And, I gradually, you start tapering away of all the things you're focusing on. Yes, you shouldn't be thinking about every single cue under the sun to perform a deadlift, say. But you should be thinking at each stage, the tension before you lift. Can you feel everything? Checking in. Then driving your feet into the floor and standing up with it, or whatever cue you use to pick the weight up. Get to the top. Have you finished the rep? Yes, cool. Now break from the hip on the way down. Like, they're really simple cues, but it can take such a long time to have that simplicity, because I've earned, like, for say someone like myself and yourself, is like we've been in the trenches long enough and we've earned the right to only have to think about cues 1 to 3 rather than cues 1 to 10. So because they're now, those other 7 are automated, because we don't need to overthink it. And I think it's when you are relatively new to these kind of things, or you have an imbalance and you're trying to rectify it, I guess this will be asking you for your opinion on this, but I would say, like, once you've kind of you got to that feeling of, okay, now my glutes are taking most of the force and so forth, then maybe if you was doing your exercises 5 times a week, you might go down to 4 times, then 3 times, then maybe doing it, say, every other session or something like that. Would that be a way to, say, phase out, to say, the physio prehab, or to you get to the point where you then don't need that per se, or would you keep them in pretty much consistently?
Yeah, great question. So there's not like a discrete point where you go from rehab to prehab to training. It's all one continuum, and it's all training. So the point at which a rehab move becomes an accessory exercise, becomes actual training, becomes technique work, they're all arbitrary and plucked out. Ultimately, we're trying to improve the skill of the movement, whether we're injured or we're like just trying to eke out the last bits of performance. So if somebody has, like, if they're in loads of pain, then the exercises are probably going to look a little bit further away from the movement we're trying to improve. So if they've just had a back spasm deadlifting, they're probably not going to be doing heavy deadlifts. They might be doing some sort of stretches, some sort of balances to try and figure out and untangle the mechanism that's given them pain in the first place. However, they will always, or should always, be improving the skill of the deadlift. And you've explained it really beautifully there, in that you're thinking about 3 Qs rather than 10 Qs, because those are the things that are going to improve your deadlift the most for where you are at the moment. And I love the golf swing as an analogy, because it's so clearly a very skilled movement. Great golfers aren't thinking about the same things that beginner golfers are thinking about in their swing, but they are still trying to refine that swing to make it better. And if we look at something like the deadlift, it's the same sort of thing. Like a real beginner or somebody who's injured will be trying to improve the motor pattern of their deadlift with some exercises that might look more basic, but it's just a continuum all the way up to an elite powerlifter who's working on really fine margins, trying to improve their bar path by fractions of a millimeter. Like, it's still just skill development. And depending where they are in their season and what's going on with their mechanics, how many times a week they're doing those exercises that are really far away from the skill. So if it's the off season, then you might have loads of movement mechanics to try and address imbalance. But as they're peaking towards a competition, then you want to get back to that specificity of just deadlifting more and more like your competition style.
Yeah. I mean, so with all your experience, especially with like the movement mechanics side of stuff, and what would you say are some of the most common imbalances that you've seen that people come to you with?
Yep. Well, single-sided sportsman, like we talked about before, if somebody has rowed on one side of the boat, or they are a racket sports player swinging one arm and having it loaded more than the other, that's a really obvious one where they've just trained one side of the body more. So when they come into a gym environment and they're doing squats and deadlifts and presses, which are all bilateral, they're, in a perfect world, they'd use both sides equally, but because they've got one side that's so much more developed, the easy path is to use that strong side more to get the job done. And over time, it gets even stronger. So you can get overuse injuries on that preloaded side. That's really common. And I think probably the second one I think of is desk workers. Because we're so sedentary now, most of us are sat down. We have that adaptive shortening of the front of the hip, and we're sort of sitting on our glutes, where there's this weird combination of long but tight and weak. So in something like a deadlift, they're not going to be doing their job very well. It's quite a common mechanism for hip pinches as well, because the front of the hip gets that adaptive shortening and tightening to try and stabilize the hip and do the work that the glute's not doing. So it pulls the femur higher into the hip socket. That's quite a common sort of front back imbalance, if you think about it like that. And third one, I'd say sagittal. So you can have a plane imbalance as well. So people who are very forward, back, up and down dominant, they will then struggle moving sideways and rotating. So if somebody's done a lot of gym-based training and then they go back to field sports, they struggle to change direction, and they lack that sort of frontal and transverse plane control. And that even applies to stuff like pressing, where because we're always pressing in the same plane of motion, we don't use some of the big muscles. So I think a good example, like lats in pressing, you wouldn't think that you use your lats very much when you're pressing overhead, but they're actually really important to stabilize the shoulder. They're like the glutes of the upper body, and they work very well in the frontal plane, which is why wide grip chins are so effective for building lats. But because everything we do is sagittal, they don't get much stimulation in that frontal plane, so they actually start to miss out, or the shoulder starts to miss out on the stability that they could provide, and you're kind of losing a key player if the lats aren't stabilizing your shoulder. So that's something you see quite a lot, especially in CrossFit.
So you build a lot of thickness rather than width in the bodybuilding world.
yeah, that's good.
So based on that, I mean, you talk obviously, especially with the barbell usage and how being a bilateral movement, we then need to make sure that we try and evenly load as possible, just to kind of obviously make sure that one side doesn't go too far behind. So what would maybe some of the prescriptions that you'd try to implement to improve the weaker side? Like, for instance, do you use a lot of barbells with these sort of people, or would you focus mainly on, say, dumbbells and kettlebells and stuff, so single-sided work, or even barbells with one hand? Like, what would be some of your prescriptions?
Yeah, as always, it depends on who the athlete is and what their function is, but all of those are good tools for addressing imbalances and how specific you want to be. If somebody's a CrossFitter, their sport is predominantly, well, not necessarily predominantly, there's a lot more dumbbell stuff coming in nowadays and single leg work, but they need to squat. So actually, if you can address the imbalance with a barbell and make it closer to the barbell movements they'll be performing in their sports, then you should. But otherwise, anything's fair game, really. Whatever tool is best suited to unpick the dysfunction that individual has is a good one. In terms of, if it is as simple as a strength imbalance, which it very rarely is, just a pure, like, this leg, they both work exactly the same, one side's just stronger than the other. But if it was the case, then literally just hammering that weak side with more reps, like doing double reps or triple reps on that one side for any sort of unilateral movement, will just at the very least get the strength imbalance closer to even. But then there's also tweaks in just position and setup. Like, you can have this is where a lot of the silly lunges come into play. If you have one side loaded with a reach away, you can encourage the body to shift into the joint that's not doing as much work. So simple one, if you've got hands overhead and you side bend to the right, you're going to shift your hips left to stay balanced. So that's one way of getting that left hip to take a little bit more of the workload. And there's all sorts of combinations of trying to encourage the joint or a specific muscle to take more workload without making it a conscious bodybuilding exercise. As always, we want the body to work as one cohesive unit, rather than trying to really think, I want left glute med to be doing this exercise and left glute med alone.
Yeah. So overall, you wouldn't be saying you should now just put down the barbells, put down your right-hand sided dumbbells, and only do them all on your left for X amount of months to build up your strength. You wouldn't recommend that then, no?
No. I mean, it's not a terrible idea. I mean, it would definitely get the left side stronger. But you still want to train the right side, unless you're in absolute bits and your body's completely broken, which no one's is. You want to be training, not in rehab. I think psychologically that's just a dangerous way to frame it for people. A lot of people think they've got a little niggle, so therefore they're broken and they shouldn't train. So you can still train, you can still improve your fitness and overall athleticism. It's just, we want the body's workload distribution to be a little bit better.
Yeah.
And it's, like I say, it's skill training at the end of the day.
So my experience over the years, that how I've kind of addressed this, where my say knowledge hasn't been as in depth as yours, I've always kind of, like, if I've known someone that have, say, a weaker, say, right side or anything like that, and they want to improve their squat, as an example, we'd do all the accessories at the start and finish on the squat rather than starting the squat. So basically, at that point, both muscles are pretty much tired. And when tired muscles and you're tired as well, when they work together, I found that you kind of work a bit better, because you're weak. You're basically, your weaker side has to work harder, and your stronger side is tired anyway. So basically, using the bodybuilding example, basically like pre and post exhaust, like that thing, like it's is so beneficial. And it's like, for instance, it's like, so I put up a post on Instagram the other day of like pairings of exercises that I like to do with people. And it's because it's like, so pairing a sumo deadlift with a conventional deadlift, where for most people, their conventional deadlift, obviously depending on their mechanics stuff, is normally stronger than their sumo deadlift because it's treated as an accessory. So by overloading the sumo deadlift, by the time you then come back into the conventional deadlift, your glutes, hips, everything's fired up. So that you're doing like 6 reps, and by the reps 5, you're like, fuck, my glutes are on fire. Whereas normally you do 6 reps at that same weight, or even 12 reps if you did 6 and 6, it still wouldn't feel the same because you're pre-exhausting the other movements. So it's definitely been something that I've utilized within my own training and with clients, that basically get yourself tired correctly first and then do your big movements, because at the end of the day you're still going to be getting stronger at that big lift.
That's super cool, because it's something we do at Red Pill as well.
Really?
Using the pre and post fatigues as a movement mechanic corrective in training. So doing like a single leg exercise into a bilateral exercise, you essentially activate the muscle group or get into the plane of motion you want to encourage in the main movement. So you could do like a single leg deadlift into a back squat, because depending on how you tweak the single leg deadlifts, you can bias in one muscle, and then it's like a skill in the brain, like that's now fired up. The brain's like, oh, that's how I access that muscle in that direction, and then you go straight into a back squat and it connects the dots. So there's that very close proximity. Whereas if you did all the single leg deadlifts on Monday and you did your squats on Friday, it's not going to connect the dots quite so easily. And that again is just a great example of why it's skill. It's your body learning as well as training. You have to build those neural pathways of, this is how I access those muscles in that way, in that movement, which is the key point. It's got to be relevant to the skill that you're actually working on. And that's really cool how it sort of organically happened for you, and one of the things that we do.
That's really good. That's because for me, I think even just like when you're looking at that, is when it comes to like pre-fatiguing a muscle as well, like you're getting more bang for your buck, because you're like, at the end of the day, unless you're powerlifting and you're literally looking for your top end strength, so unless you're doing that, but if you're looking just to get stronger overall and use lighter weight, essentially, that you can, and you'll still get a similar sort of challenging stimulus. And you got to think, if you're actually putting less load onto your body's going to take a little less stress. So your nervous system will be able to recover, which means you'll be able to repeat it all again a lot sooner. Whereas when you're doing top end strength work, you'll notice it takes so many more days to recover, which is why personally, whenever I do any type of program for like a heavy deadlift or anything like that, it's always towards the end of the week, just so, because how much it takes out of you, like for the next 4 days. And if you do have it earlier on in the week, the other sessions after that will be a lot more, say, skill-based or like volume-based, rather than anything to do with, say, top-end strength, because just the recovery side of things is just completely different.
Yep. Really good point. And you've hit the nail on the head there, and that it's the stimulus. So if we're trying to get stronger, your muscles don't know whether you're pulling a 200 kilo deadlift or you're doing a weird single leg deadlift with a reach, where the muscle, the force going through the muscle and the tension in the muscle could actually be higher, because in a conventional deadlift, that muscle is hiding, so it never gets any stimulus to grow and adapt. And if you think about it like that, the single leg weird version of a deadlift is going to make you stronger than the 200 kilo deadlift, especially in that muscle. And there's loads of things you can extrapolate from that, and is a whole different topic of discussion for strength training in general, because you can get stronger, and you see it in athletes who are incredibly strong, but you get them doing a type of exercise that they've not done before, and they don't know how to recruit those muscles. They're sweating, they're panting, their muscles are trembling because that muscle group has never done that task, and they will come out of it stronger because those muscles are getting overworked to a greater extent than they would do with a super heavy traditional lift. And I think it's really important to understand that just because there's not a huge amount of weight being involved, it doesn't mean it's not the most efficient way for you to get stronger.
I mean, you say that, like, you put anyone that doesn't stretch or anything into a yoga session, think about how hard and how much of a pool of sweat you end up in that. Put into positions, you're like, hang on a minute, this is not where I'm supposed to be, and stuff like that. So just that different type of stimulus, like, that's the massive benefit. So I think just to finish up, would you say imbalances cause injury? Or is it something that our body kind of learns to live with, so we hide it? So yes, there might be, say, one side stronger than the other or whatever, but would that always end up in an injury, do you say? When I say, well, I know that's very loaded to the point of saying, well, it depends on what stresses you put yourself under. But doesn't imbalance mean you're going to get injured?
Short answer, no. However, well, first of all, let's preface this with everyone is asymmetrical and has an imbalance because we've all got preferences and have adapted to whatever we've used our body for through our lives. There are going to be certain areas of the body, certain muscle groups that we have a preference to use because we're better at using those than others. There's actually some research that suggests that asymmetry does not lead to a greater incidence of injury. However, I think we need to look at this logically and through personal experience and the people I've worked with. If one side, one muscle group, one joint is doing more work, that naturally predisposes those areas of the body to experience overuse injuries. So if somebody's putting all their weight through the right leg when they're squatting, that right leg, if the volume or intensity gets cranked up in their training, which it always does if you're progressing, at some point it could break down as a result of that imbalance. That doesn't mean we should only train if we're perfectly symmetrical. Like I said earlier, that's the opposite of the situation. We should always be training, but just having an awareness that if there is a major imbalance, then whatever's getting overworked as a result of it is predisposed to break down if the volume and intensity ramp up too quickly. And that's probably the key point, is that volume and intensity ramp ups are where injuries happen. Your body can adapt to almost anything if the progression is slow enough. That's how people do sort of crazy feats of strength, like press ups on their pinky fingers and stuff like that. They've just built it up slowly over time, and the body is then able to adapt to it.
Well, your one arm pull up is an example.
Yeah, exactly. It's just slow. Like, that was super slow, like really super slow. Yeah, I was able to get my body to adapt to that demand because I was just patient enough to give it the space. If I'd have jumped up day one and tried to do a negative, having not done any single arm hanging, I probably would have dislocated my shoulder. But like, not even joking, like, that's a very real thing that could have happened when 80 plus kilos is suddenly pulling your shoulder out of its socket. So it can cause injury, but it doesn't mean that any imbalance is dangerous and should hold you back from training. I think in terms of when people need to address imbalances, more experienced people, because they've had it ingrained over a longer period of time, they've put their body through more reps in that imbalance, they probably stand to gain more because they're closer to their, not that I think anyone's got a ceiling on their potential, but they are closer to their physiological limits, let's phrase it like that. And if they're super strong, they've got a 300 kilo deadlift, but they're really unbalanced on using their right leg versus their left. Are they going to get over 300 by getting their right leg even stronger, or are there some low-hanging fruits to be had by just bringing that left leg up? Like, if we know the right leg has got this strong, then the left leg could definitely get a bit stronger. That's definitely possible. But if they're really near their limit, then maybe it's going to be a lot harder and a lot less value on your training time to get that right leg even stronger. So spending a little bit of time of bringing up the weak side is probably going to confer them performance benefits as well as potentially reduce the injury risk. In a beginner, however, if they're very, very right-sided dominant, they're probably not going to be held back by that. Their right leg's still got loads of room to grow into, so their performance isn't going to necessarily increase faster in the short term, by working on their weak leg. Obviously, over time, the imbalance could get greater if we let that right leg run away from the left. But it's probably less of a pressing issue at that stage. Get them enjoying training, seeing results, and then look at the imbalances later down the line if they even become a problem.
Yeah, I guess that's something in my own experiences as well, is where this is when everything has to, like you said, when it depends, so everything has to be goal specific, because you might have a bias as a trainer, as a coach and whatever, but you need to remember who the person is in front of you and their goals and what they're trying to get out of something. Because if you're someone that really likes people to get top end strength and they're relatively new, they're going to have massive strength gains really quickly, which is everyone loves like those ego boosting bits and stuff like that, which is great. But you have to remember the stresses that you're putting that person's body under, and that's where you're going to start to identify these issues. So where one side's stronger than the other, so forth. And that's where the injuries normally come in, because they haven't been able to lay their foundations before that, which is then where when you've got someone that's new, working around that like 70 to 80% range is a great place to be with weights, which is essentially why bodybuilders a lot of the time is like they stay relatively injury free to a degree until they do something outside of just utilizing a single muscle. And they do, like, say they play a sport or they try and move like, so then that's where things like CrossFit is so good, because of the levels of exposure to so many different things. But I think then our egos take over a lot of the time, and then we push ourselves beyond where we're capable of because everyone else is doing it. Yeah. And then you're like, oh, that tweaked the back a little bit. Okay, it'll be fine. And then you forget that little tweak, and then you do it again and again, and then next thing you know, bang, you then fucked your back up. Yeah. So it's that steady thing. Normally those little tweaks, a little like precursors to tell you, like, you push a little bit too much today. Maybe don't do that again too soon, and lay those foundations. And at the end of the day, as you said, muscle imbalances are pretty much, as I said, we're asymmetrical. We're not going to be perfect on both sides, but making sure that we're trying to utilize a lot of unilateral work within our training to do our bilateral work as well, especially if you're a general training individual. So you're for GPP, then make sure you incorporate all styles of training and all planes and stuff to make sure you're kind of bulletproof in your body.
Yeah, great way of putting it. And actually, I've just been listening to a podcast, the Tim Ferriss podcast with Steffi Cohen, who's maybe like, have you listened to that one?
Yeah.
Maybe like the best female powerlifter of all time. And she says she always programs a phase of GPP to precede a peak into a competition, to add in that variability. And she describes it as like having movement options. So because you're not getting super specific, you're giving your body exposure to those other movements, which ultimately you end up lacking in your specific competition prep. And by having that GPP multi-plane phase to training, it does just help address imbalances before they become an issue. And I think it's a nice way to, even if you do have a very narrow movement range in your sport, like powerlifting is 3 exercises, having the awareness that you need to counterbalance that narrowness with a GPP phase, I think is quite cool, and a nice simple way for people to build it into their own training.
Yeah, so I think we've covered that really well today with imbalances, and we hope that you've been able to take some stuff away. So I think just to like recap the bit of part where if you've got an imbalance, don't worry, it's normal. Just basically either 1, be aware of it, 2, try and then make sure that the really good thing is to film yourself as well. If you don't know if you have anything, film yourself doing, especially any bilateral movements, and try and look for any imbalances. And if you're unsure, reach out to Ash, myself, we'll be sure to help you, or find a coach that you respect and know they'll be able to help you, and they'll be able to give you some advice on maybe what to start looking at, and maybe how to bring up both sides rather than just always favoring the one. So, but we really appreciate your time for listening today, and we hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next week.
Cheers, guys.